Sir Ernst Hans Josef Gombrich CBE-FBA was an Austrian-born art historian who became a naturalised British citizen in 1947 and spent most of his working life in the United Kingdom. He was the author of many works of cultural history and art history, most notably The Story of Art, a book widely regarded as one of the most accessible introductions to the visual arts. Biography. The son of Karl Gombrich and Leonie Hock, Gombrich was born in Vienna, Austria-Hungary, into an assimilated bourgeois family of Jewish origin who were part of a sophisticated social and musical milieu. His father was a lawyer and former classmate of Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and his mother was a distinguished pianist who graduated from the Vienna Conservatoire with the school's Medal of Distinction. At the Conservatoire she was a pupil of, amongst others, Anton Bruckner. However, rather than follow a career as a concert pianist, she became an assistant to Theodor Leschetizky. She also knew Arnold Schoenberg, Gustav Mahler, Hugo Wolf and Johannes Brahms. Rudolf Serkin was a close family friend. Adolf Busch and members of the Busch Quartet regularly met and played in the family home. Throughout his life, Gombrich maintained a deep love and knowledge of classical music. He was a competent cellist and in later life at home in London regularly played the chamber music of Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven and others with his wife and his elder sister D. Forsyth, a concert violinist. Gombrich was educated at Theresianum Secondary School and at Vienna University, where he studied art history under Hans Tietze, Karl Maria Swoboda, Julius von Schlosser and Joseph Strigowski, completing a Ph.D. thesis on the Mannerist architecture of Giulio Romano, supervised by von Schlosser. In 1936 he married Ilse Heller, a pupil of his mother, and herself an accomplished pianist. Their only child, Richard Gombrich, went on to become a noted Indologist and scholar of Buddhism, acting as the Bodin Professor of Sanskrit at Oxford University in 1976 to 2004. After publishing his first book, A Little History of the World in German in 1936, written for children and adolescents, seeing it become a hit only to be banned by the Nazis for pacifism and fleeing to Britain in 1939. He took up a post as a research assistant at the Warburg Institute, University of London. During World War II, Gombrich worked for the BBC World Service, monitoring German radio broadcasts. When in 1945 an upcoming announcement was prefaced by a Bruckner symphony written for Wagner's death, Gombrich guessed correctly that Hitler was dead and promptly broke the news to Churchill. He returned to the Warburg Institute in November 1945, where he became Senior Research Fellow, Lecturer, Reader, and eventually Professor of the History of the Classical Tradition and Director of the Institute. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1960, made CBE in 1966, knighted in 1972, and appointed a member of the Order of Merit in 1988. He was the recipient of numerous additional honours, including Goethe Prize 1994 and Balsam Prize in 1985 for History of Western Art. Gombrich was close to a number of Austrian émigrés who fled to the West prior to the Anschluss, among them Karl Popper, Friedrich Hayek and Max Perutz. He was instrumental in bringing to publication Popper's magnum opus The Open Society and Its Enemies. Each had known the other only fleetingly in Vienna, as Gombrich's father served his law apprenticeship with Popper's father. They became lifelong friends in exile. Work. Gombrich remarked that he had two very different publics. Amongst scholars he was known particularly for his work on the Renaissance and the psychology of perception, but also his thoughts on cultural history and tradition. To a wider, non-specialist audience he was known for the accessibility and immediacy of his writing and his ability to present scholarly work in a clear and unfussy manner. Gombrich's first book, and the only one he did not write in English, was Einike's Weltgeschichte für junge Leser, published in Germany in 1936. It was very popular and translated into several languages, but was not available in English until 2005, when a translation of a revised edition was published as A Little History of the World. He did most of this translation and revision himself, and it was completed by his longtime assistant and secretary Caroline Mustel and his granddaughter Leonie Gombrich after his death. The Story of Art, first published in 1950 and currently in its 16th edition, is widely regarded as one of the most accessible introductions to the history of visual arts. Originally intended for adolescent readers, it has sold millions of copies and been translated into more than 30 languages. Other major publications include Art and Illusion, regarded by critics to be his most influential and far-reaching work, and the essays Gathered in Meditations on a Hobby Horse and The Image and the Eye. Other important books are Abby Warburg, An Intellectual Biography, The Sense of Order and the Preference for the Primitive. The complete list of his publications, E.H. Gombrich, a bibliography, was published by Joseph Burney Trapp in 2000. Thought. Psychology of Perception. When Gombrich arrived in England in 1936, art history was largely concerned with connoisseurship. Gombrich, however, had been brought up in the Viennese culture of building and was concerned with wider issues of cultural tradition and the relationship between science and art. This latter breadth of interest can be seen both in his working relationship with the Austrian psychoanalyst and art historian, Ernst Gombrich, concerning the art of caricature in his later books, The Sense of Order and the classic Art and Illusion. It was in Art and Illusion that he introduced the ideas of schemata, making and matching, correction, and trial and error, influenced by conjecture and refutation, in Popper's philosophy of science. In Gombrich's view, the artist compares what he has drawn or painted with what he is trying to draw, paint, and by a feedback loop, gradually corrects the drawing, painting to look more like what he is seeing. The process does not start from scratch, however. Each artist inherits schemata that designate reality by force of convention. These schemata, plus the techniques and works of previous masters, are the starting points from which the artist begins her own process of trial and error. This Popperian description of conjecture and refutation, trial and error, is eminently applicable to the story of visual discoveries in art. Our formula of schema and correction, in fact, illustrates this very procedure. You must have a starting point, a standard of comparison, to begin that process of making and matching and remaking which finally becomes embodied in the finished image. The artist cannot start from scratch, but he can criticize his forerunners. The philosophical conceptions developed by Popper for a philosophy of science meshed well with Gombrich's ideas. For a more robust explanation of the history of art, Gombrich had written his first major work, The Story of Art, in 1950, 10 years before Art and Illusion. The earlier book has been described as viewing the history of art as a narrative moving from what ancient artists knew to what later artists saw, and as Gombrich was always more concerned with the individual rather than mass movements. He saw the use of scientific and psychological explanations as key to understanding how these individual artists saw, and how they built upon the traditions they had inherited and of which they were a part. With the dialectics of making and matching, schema and correction, Gombrich sought to ground artistic development on more universal truths, closer to those of science, than on what he regarded as fashionable or vacuous terms such as zeitgeist and other abstractions. Renaissance studies. Gombrich's contribution to the study of Renaissance art began with his doctoral dissertation on mannerism. In this he argues that the work of Giulio Romano, at the Palazzo del Te, was not the work of a decadent Renaissance artist but rather showed how the painter responded to the demands of a patron, eager for fashionable novelty. The 4-volume series Studies in the Art of the Renaissance comprises the volumes Norman form, symbolic images, the heritage of Appel's new light on old masters, and made a major contribution to the study of symbolism in the work of this period. Gombrich was a great admirer of Leonardo da Vinci and wrote extensively on him, both in these volumes and elsewhere. Influence. Gombrich has been called the best-known art historian in Britain, perhaps in the world, and also one of the most influential scholars and thinkers of the 20th century. His wide-ranging and deep scholarship, and his interest in incorporating scientific thinking into questions associated with the humanities, is credited with revitalizing art history in the English-speaking world. Criticism. Gombrich was sensitive to the criticism that he did not like modern art and was obliged to defend his position on occasion. He has also been criticized for taking what is now viewed as a Eurocentric, not to say neo-colonialist, view of art, and for not including women artists in much of his writing on Western art. His answer to the latter was that he was writing a history of art as it was, and that women artists did not feature widely in the West before the 20th century. He admired 20th-century female artists such as Bridget Riley, whose work was included in a revised edition of The Story of Art. Honours and awards. Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Knight Bachelor. Austrian Cross of Honour for Science and Art, First Class. Paul Emerite for Sciences and Arts. Order of Merit. Balzan Prize for History of Art of the West. City of Vienna Prize for Humanities. Ludwig Wittgenstein Prize of the Austrian Science Foundation. Honorary Doctorate from the University of Vienna. Leverhulme Medal of the British Academy. In the Favoriton of Vienna, the Gombrich-Gasse was named for him in 2009. In 2011, the Arts Historical Society of the University of Vienna created the Sir Ernst Gombrich Young Investigator Award to encourage and reward highly qualified graduates of the discipline of art history. Selected publications. The Preference for the Primitive. Episodes in the History of Western Taste and Art. London. Phaidon 2002. The Uses of Images. Studies in the Social Function of Art and Visual Communication. London. Phaidon 1999. Topics of Our Time. 20th Century Issues in Learning and in Art. London. Phaidon 1991. Reflections on the History of Art. Views and Reviews. Oxford. Phaidon 1987. Tributes. Interpreters of Our Cultural Tradition. Oxford. Phaidon 1984. Ideals and Idols. Essays on Values in History and Art. Oxford. Phaidon 1979. The Sense of Order. A Study in the Psychology of Decorative Art. Oxford. Phaidon 1979. Abby Warburg. An Intellectual Biography. London. The Warburg Institute 1970. The Image and the Eye. Further Studies in the Psychology of Pictorial Representation. Oxford. Phaidon 1982. ISBN 0-7148-22450. Studies in the Art of the Renaissance. London. Phaidon 1967-1986-1. Norman Form. 1967-2. Symbolic Images. 1972-3. The Heritage of Appels. 1976-4. New Light on Old Masters. 1986. Meditations on a Hobby Horse and Other Essays on the Theory of Art. London. Phaidon 1963. Art and Illusion. A Study in the Psychology of Pictorial Representation. London. Phaidon 1960. The Story of Art. London. Phaidon 1950. Weltgeschichte von der Zeit bis zur Gegenwart. Wennen. S.N. 1935. English translation. A Little History of the World.